Actually, before I start, I just wanted to announce the Global Studies Association conference here that will be happening in Chicago. I think it may be the same week as the big conference in New York. So for those of you not making New York, you're certainly welcome to, not? The week later or a week before? Okay. So this is our 12th annual meeting, and people come. It's not a huge conference, so actually it's great in that way because people can really talk and get to know each other. So I would like to invite everybody here. If you'd like to participate on a panel, make a presentation, organize a panel, we're certainly open to that, and you can send me the abstract anytime over the next, probably I think we got about another 3 weeks that we're taking abstracts. So the general theme this year is the end of U.S. hegemony, question mark, which actually sort of leads into this talk because most people, when they think of the end of U.S. hegemony, think of China as the possible rising superpower. So today what I'd like to do is actually sort of divide this talk into two parts. The first part I want to make just some personal observations from the trips I've taken to China. And then I want to share a little bit of research and economic data with you. And then we could open it up for a discussion and perhaps some debate. I'm just curious, how many people here have been to China at one time or another? So it's pretty good section there. So one thing about China is that nobody can ever speak about the totality of China. It's just too damn big, and too many things are going on. And in fact, everything is going on. So if anybody tries to tell you that it's totally this way or totally that way, it ain't. It's just lots of stuff is happening, and it's happening all the time. And the future is open. So that's true for my observations, and what my arguments that I'm going to lay out also is that they're just, from my point of view and from what I've seen in my research and my observations, but I'm sure there's many things going on that I haven't seen and haven't thought about. So I've been to China 3 times. The first time was 1982, a long time ago. And that was a trip with actually the last trip of the Communist Party Marxist-Leninists. And then I was there in 2012, sort of an academic trip to a university. We were setting up a global studies department, and they wanted to talk to me and a few other folks. And this last trip that Robert introduced, where I spoke at the Marxist Institute at the Academy of Social Science Research in St. Louis University, and went to this conference. So in terms of the personal observations, let me start out actually with a film I just saw last week, and I would recommend it if you haven't seen it. I just got it from Netflix. Was Touch of Sin. Has anyone seen that recent Chinese film? This is 3 stories about corruption in China and the power of money in China. And I think it's really interesting from 2 different aspects. One, the stories that the film itself tells about corruption and money and power. And the second thing that's very interesting is that this film was made in China and was shown in China, which says something else totally different, actually, about China and the state of China. So if you have Netflix or something, spend a nice little evening, a 2-hour film or so. I think you'll find it interesting. One of my first overwhelming impressions of my 2 recent trips to China was youth. And everybody knows, of course, the incredible urban growth that China is undergoing. I think now more than half the population is an urban population in China. So the millions and millions of people who have been flooding into the urban centers for the past 2 or 3 decades are almost all people between 16 and 35 years old. The old people are staying in the countryside. That's who mainly stays out there in the rural villages. It's the young people coming in and working in the factories and the sweatshops, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have to remember is that none of these people were alive during the Maoist period of China. They don't remember that period. They've all have grown up and been born into the reform period initiated by Deng Xiaoping. And I got this impression of this sort of new urban China being created by this new generation. You know, of course, the Communist Party, the government has a lot to do with the engineering of the society and the economy. But on the other hand, this incredible culture is just exploding. A youth culture, a working class youth culture, is just exploding in every city. And in many ways, they're the class and the generations that will probably define the future of China in many ways. When I went to China, another thing about youth, this last trip, I had some very interesting conversations, and some were with party members who were in their early 30s, so rising middle cadre, right? One thing I found interesting, besides their political viewpoints, which were very interesting, I'll get into in a moment, but I was talking to one woman who is at the research institution, and her parents were party people also, and has a very nice apartment in downtown Beijing. She said that her and her husband have saved $200,000 in the bank. And she asked me how much I had saved too. We were sort of talking about that stuff. But I found that pretty interesting, that a young married couple in their 32, 33, 34 years old, party cadre, had been able to save $200K at this point in their lives, indicating that that is a large part of the middle class, the real middle class, right? And another young guy who was helped shepherding, taking us around from this conference, he was about the same age, and he was showing us pictures of his SUV, which he was very proud of, and talking about leading a comfortable life and going out with his wife and his son to a picnic outside of Beijing on the weekends with his friends. Sort of like listening to somebody here in Chicago who's a college grad talking about his SUV and taking a nice weekend picnic up in Michigan or something. So I think that's probably tells you a lot about the developing middle class within the Communist Party. That people within the Communist Party in their 30s who are moving up the party, who are doing well, are very much part of the system, economically and politically. In terms of political trends, there's lots of different political trends, and I cannot go over all of them, but I'll let me tell a few stories about some of the conversations I had with a number of different people coming from different points of views. One is that there's a reevaluation of the Cultural Revolution going on. When I say a reevaluation, I don't mean by everybody in the whole party. I mean some people in the party are reevaluating the Cultural Revolution. That's true about all these comments. Some people in the party, right? The reevaluation is basically that it was a one-sided analysis of the Cultural Revolution, and that while they had a look at, there were positive things that happened in the Cultural Revolution. And one of the positive things was the struggle against corruption and growing inequality. And that aspect of the Cultural Revolution had been sort of bad mouth and not thought about and overlooked in sort of the ongoing evaluation. The Cultural Revolution was all horrible and everybody, you know, was the worst thing that happened in Chinese history. So it's not that they want to glorify the Cultural Revolution. It's not that type of reevaluation. It's an attempt to come to what they see as a more balanced view of what on in the Cultural Revolution. And obviously, it's initiated because of the great inequalities and the problems that are going on today. So for all the problems of the Cultural Revolution, if you go back and look at Mao Zedong's arguments against Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi and others, it was exactly that if we take this particular road of development, we're going to end up in a capitalist society with great inequality and growing poverty and all sorts of problems with corruption. And when people look around today in China, obviously that's some of what people see. So naturally it leads to a reevaluation among some people. This conversation was when I went to Shantou, which is about 100 miles north of Guangdong in Hong Kong. It's a big industrial city, one of those industrial city of 8-10 million people that you never hear of, you know, as big as Chicago. And this was a party member who was at the university, and you know, when we talked, it would be private. You know, I mean, when in a group, she would not talk about these things. When we're sitting alone, you know, talking to each other, then these things would come out. And one thing that she said she feared was that of you know, violent and bloody explosions because of the inequalities and people losing faith in the government. So that was one thing. And by the way, Shantou has the only museum about the Cultural Revolution in the entire country. And it's up on a hillside, about 3-4 different buildings. It's sort of interesting. You walk in to the area, there's, of course, 2 cats on both sides of the gate, you know, a white cat and a black cat. And those of you who are a little familiar with Deng Xiaoping and can relate to that. Now, yeah, it doesn't matter the color of the cat as long as it catches the mice was one of his famous sayings. My last trip to Beijing was interesting. I first spoke at the Academy of Social Research, and the Academy is a big building right on the main boulevard of Beijing, and the Marxist school like has one floor. There's all sorts of floors and all sorts of research going on. The guy who picked me up from the airport, you know, this had just been recently after the trial of Bo Xilai. So Bo Xilai had just been put in jail for the rest of his life. And how many of you are familiar with Bo Xilai and the whole thing? That's been pretty recent. And I asked him about it. He said, I love Bo Xilai. You know, he said, in fact, he didn't say I, he said, we love Bo Xilai, was how he put it. So we talked a little bit about that. When I went to Tsinghua University, which is one of the elite universities, and again, the Marxist school, thousands of students, the Marxist school has one small building with a couple hundred students. Bo Xilai was popular among the faculty there also. So after I talked to the students and there was a good debate and a lot of questions, one of the faculty members took me down the hall, and there's all these pictures of all the Chinese revolutionary heroes in this hall. So there's a big portrait of Mao Zedong, a big portrait of Liu Shaoqi. But then as you're walking down, he stops me in front of a picture of about 10 generals and points out not Liu Shaoqi, but Lin Biao's picture also. Now, some of you know a little about Chinese history, that Lin Biao was one of the people who was purged and killed during the Cultural Revolution for ultra-leftism. Liu Shaoqi had been the president, was jailed and died in jail for rightist errors. I said, well, you have all these. He said, yeah, we have everybody, anybody who played an important role in Chinese revolutionary history should be here. Now that's very different from when I went in 1982. That never would have been said. And in fact, when we went down the hall, there was a big portrait of Prime Minister Wen, who just left office. And the New York Times had run a large article about Wen's family and his family having billions of dollars. Although nothing directly related to him personally, but his mother, his sisters, his brothers, blah, 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 blah. And this Marxist party member who was walking me down the hall points at Wen and says, "I hate him. I hate Wen. His family are billionaires." Shocking, because nobody in 1982 would have ever dared to say anything like that, not only to other Chinese, but certainly not to a foreigner. So obviously people who were supporters of Bo Xiaoli felt free to speak, right, and were open with their opinions and open to a foreigner. And in fact, I asked them about the debate, and they said, "We can talk about anything. You know, yeah, it's no problem. We talk about everything." I think probably the one thing, though, they don't talk about is overthrowing the Communist Party. That cannot be part of the conversation. What can be part of the conversation is the Communist Party should be doing A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That's where the conversation is. That, again, is a type of political openness that I never saw in China, nor from my studies. I began to become interested in China during the Cultural Revolution when I was a college student, and I've been reading and thinking about China probably now for 40, 45 years. I don't think that type of openness was ever, quite like that in any other period that I've seen. At lunchtime, after I spoke at the Academy of Science, Academy of Social Research, we went to lunch with a little group of 5 of us, a Bo Xilai supporter. The head of the Marxist school was there, and it was interesting. He was not an academic guy. I think he came out of the military. He immediately liked me because in my presentation I talked about working at the steel mill and that I came to academic life later in my life, and he immediately took my arm and said, I too am not from an academic background, and so he immediately sort of related to me from that point of view. And as we sat around, and this woman who I mentioned, her and her husband had $2,000 saved up, was in this conversation too, there became a very vigorous discussion over economic political policy in China, just over lunch. It was very open, very vigorous. I couldn't follow it all because they would get very involved and it would go off in Mandarin, and no one was particularly translating for me at that point. But they would stop and ask my opinions on various things. And so at one point I talked about how in the United States a large part of the left were looking at cooperatives as an alternative form of socialist economic construction. As in Venezuela, as in Mondragon in Spain, and the head of the Marxist school's reply was, well, that's chaotic. You need leadership. Everyone can't be dissolved in these types of discussions and stuff. You have to do planning, which immediately set off a debate with the Bo Xilai guy. So they started to get to it. Now, this is this guy's boss, right? And I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but I have argued with my bosses at times, but always with some trepidation in the back of my mind, am I going to get my ass fired if I go too far? That may be familiar with a lot of you. I didn't sense that at all in this discussion. This was an honest sort of back and forth debate over ideas. And others joined in. And then the Bo Xilai guy turned to me and asked me some question. I said, well, in America, we're not trying to figure out how to build socialism for the people. We're trying to figure out how the people can build socialism. And as soon as I said that, he turned to the translator. He said, pushed him and said, tell him that. Tell the director that. Tell him, give him that quote. So I thought, that discussion, again, to me was very open and very interesting. I was pleasantly surprised about the sort of openness of the discussion itself and how broad it was. This type of openness continued at this conference I then went to a couple days later, which was co-sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Institute, which is the political think tank of the Der Linke Party, the left party in Germany, and the International Communist Party, the International Department of the Communist Party in China. And Rosa Luxemburg, they have representatives in Beijing, and they have also opened up offices in New York recently. In fact, they'll probably be at the Left Scholars Conference, I'm sure, in New York coming up. It was the Rosa Luxemburg people who invited me because I had published with their journal Das Argument, which was published in Berlin. So the invitees, it was small, nice hotel, but there were about 4 or 5 guys from Der Linke, some who were in Parliament. There was a pretty high level, very articulate, smart guy from the Socialist Party of France. There was a head of the International Department of the Japanese Communist Party. There was a Cuban guy there from the Cuban Party. And there was a woman minister from the government in Ecuador. And then myself and a guy, Bill Tabb, who's a Marxist economist from New York. There was the other American there. Oh, and an Italian guy from the Communist Party Refoundation Party. So it's not that big. And then there's maybe 15 or 20 people from the Communist Party. And everyone's giving papers, you know, on different topics for 2 days. And so we're at a big table talking to each other, and then outside the table there's some people listening, but probably no more than 50 or 60 people in the room total of that. So sort of a small, concentrated conference to talk about socialism, the financial crisis, and what's happening around the world. A lot of it on Europe, because a lot of people, the French, the Italians, the Germans are there. But at the conference, I found a couple interesting things. One, the guy sitting next to me was from Peking University, where you guys just told me that you had taught for 2 summers. And he represented another line. His line is that, look, basically China has become capitalist at this point, largely. So the best way to move towards the socialist future that we still want is to give independence to the trade union movement, build democratic institutions, and the constitutionality, that we need laws and independent courts, and this is the way, this is the best way that the working class can defend itself under the current conditions of the capitalist market. And if we don't promote democracy in this way, the working class will be crushed, as will, and the Communist Party will go down that road. So that's different from the left line of the Bolshevik people, who are more mass movement, mass participation, sing the red songs, Mao Zedong. The guy who picked me up at the airport, he said, I love Bolshevik. When I told him about this conference, he didn't know it, about this conference, so he worked himself into it through his contacts and his friends. And so he made his little 5-10 minute presentation from the Bolshevik line. And then the others, which I think are the dominant line within the party, I'm not sure, but it seems so, are the people who say the party needs to give leadership, that the masses are interested basically in a better life and material wealth, and we need to provide it for them, but we also provide political leadership. And only the Communist Party can provide that political leadership. That's our responsibility, that's our duty. And we know there's problems. We know there's problems. Some of our companies are exploiting people in Africa. We're aware of that. We know there's problems of corruption here in China. We're aware of that. And we're working on it. This is a complex, long process. And the party has to give leadership to solve all these problems. So trust us. We're aware of it all, and we're working on it all. So those were the sort of the 3 lines that I was exposed to in terms of the Marxist debates that I saw. And I think from reading literature, there's other schools of thought out there also. Confucius lines of thought within the party, for example. At the last thing I want to say about the conference, and then I want to get a little more into some of the economic research I want to present to you, was that as people talked, a lot of the discussion was around 21st century socialism. So, and that's, of course, was President Chavez's, way that he explained socialist development in Venezuela. And that's what a lot of people were talking about. The other concept they started talking about was the bien or buen vida, which is the indigenous life view of the movement in Ecuador and in Bolivia, the good life, which is an environmentally sustainable and prosperous and collective life. When I was speaking, when we had discussions and stuff, I said, it's interesting that no one's talked about the dictatorship of the proletariat. Nobody talked about that. And I said, if we were having this conference 20 or 30 years ago and talking about socialism, everybody would have been talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat as the form of socialism. And democracy was at the center of this discussion, not the dictatorship of the proletariat. I didn't hear from the Chinese, I didn't hear from the Cubans, I didn't hear from the Germans. No one talked about the DAP, as we used to say, dictatorship of the proletariat. So that changes, interesting stuff. So take that as you will. Those are just personal observations, and covers a small snippet of probably what reality is in China. So let me take maybe another 20 minutes or half hour and just talk about some research and articles that I've been writing on China. My analysis of China, I would argue that essentially a transnational capitalist class has power and hegemony in China. I think inside the Communist Party itself, there's Marxist trends, there's communists and socialists. The future is going to be struggled over. But I think both in the private sector and the state sector, which are of course closely integrated, you have a class who are deeply involved in global circuits of accumulation, who are deeply involved in cross-border flows of capital, deeply dependent on cross-border manufacturing and global assembly lines. And the way that economic development is perceived in China is through globalization. They don't conceive of economic development in China as an independent sort of a path isolated from global capital, which was the Maoist strategy, right? Was essentially cut off from most of the world except for some trade with Eastern Europe and some of this, at one point, Soviet Union. And that idea of national development, I think, you can be found in every country. I think the capitalist class, the hegemonic section of the capitalist class, whether it's the United States or Europe or Japan, Argentina, Brazil, wherever you're going to go, they all conceive of national development through the lens of global accumulation. None of them see sort of isolated economies. And in fact, I don't think you could have isolated economies in today's world. It's just not what's going on. Another unique thing about China, when I think about the ruling class, I think about it in terms of different networks of power. And so I think of the capitalist class, and the ownership of the means of production is pretty central to understanding of capitalism, but also political elites who have a tremendous power, just not over regulatory agencies, over the infrastructure, over the environment, and over millions of public employees who they determine their livelihood for also. I think we have to consider the military-industrial complex, its own network, with its own culture and its own industrial base and its own academic research. And lastly, the media and ideological and cultural apparatus. And I think one of the things that's unique about China is that all of these networks are tied very closely to the state. So that we have a status transnational capitalist class, which, and I would define the transnational capitalist class in the United States as not a status transnational capitalist class, but why it controls, has hegemony basically over the state. Its power is more within the economic realm. So in the economic research, I just want to cover a little bit about energy, manufacturing, and finance. So I'm going to start throwing out some data, and I'll try to keep it somewhat minimally, and if you want to, we can get into it deeper. I like data. Other people, it drives them sort of crazy and your eyes glaze over. But to me, analysis got to be based on something other than just theory and talk, so you got to look at data. So in terms of energy, let's look at the oil corporations first. And China has three major energy corporations. National Petroleum Corporation is the world's 5th largest oil producer. China Petroleum and Chemical Corporation, known as Sinopec, which is the 3rd largest refinery capacity in the world. And China's National Offshore Oil Corporation, 70% government owned. Most of these data, by the way, comes up to about 2010, 2012. So it's pretty current, but not from yesterday. So I examined China's largest 23 natural resource deals between 1996 and 2010, right? I think when you look at the press, a lot of times you'll see things about, oh, China's going around the world grabbing resources everywhere. They're grabbing coal, they're grabbing copper, they're grabbing oil, and it's all national champions. These are corporations that are state-owned national champions. So it's analyzed through the lens of nation-centric competition, which I think is still the mainstream view of most people, including on the left, that nations are the most important bodies in the world and sort of determine everything. So let me just give you a couple examples of what these corporations are doing, because what I found is that almost all their deals are multinational or transnational deals. They're not out buying things just for themselves. They're entering into joint ventures with other oil majors around the world. Not only oil majors, but state-owned oil majors also. So, for example, CNPC. Let me give you 2 examples here. Early one, 96, working with Sudan, bought into a partnership with a 40% share with the Greater Nile Operating Company. Also, Arcus Energy Group, a Canadian company, had 25%. State-owned Petronas, which is from Malaysia, had 30%. And a Sudanese state-owned firm, Sudpet, had 5%. In 2001, they bought into a very large area of 29,000 square mile area of production and drilling. Again, the Chinese corporation had 41%, but the Malaysians had 40%, Sudapet 8%, Sinopec 6%, and Al Taini from the United Arab Republic had 5%. If we look at Iran, then there's some big investments in Iran. They're in joint partnership with the National Iranian Oil Company that has a Swiss-based subsidiary, so that's who they work with, as well as the Japanese oil major also. If we look at Sinopec, 09, Sinopec buys into a block of oil for 1.3 billion with Marathon, with Total from France. This is in Angola, so they're also working with Sonangol, ExxonMobil, and Galp Energy from Portugal, which is their large corporation. If we look at the other oil major in China, we see here the part of the largest gas project in the world in Australia. They partner with BHP Billiton, BP, Chevron, Shell, Woodside Energy, etc. So as you go through all these multi-billion-dollar investments. What you see time and time again is not China buying oil rights exclusively. What you see time and time again are joint ventures, transnational ventures, with both state and private oil majors from around the world. So if you take oil from Angola and bring it to China, and Foxconn from Taiwan is using that oil to run their factory to make iPhones for Apple, is this a nationalist economic strategy? Is this a national champion? Or is this transnational production used for global capital? Well, I would say that's its real character. So it's not China out to seize control of oil resources around the world. Chinese manufacturing, which uses that oil, is in fact world manufacturing. So let's go into manufacturing a little bit. I'll give you two examples and then go into some more general examples. Li Feng, not Anfeng, Li Feng, which is a huge clothing subcontractor. Has anybody ever heard of Li Feng? Well, they're sort of the Walmart of clothing subcontracting. They own no factories. They own no sewing machines. They don't own maybe some computers in the office, but no manufacturing machines whatsoever. What they do have are 16,000 subcontractors in 60 countries. That's what they have. And of course, they're making clothes for every major, clothing operator in the world. Currently, and this was just in the paper a day or two ago, there's a big strike, and there's strikes going on in China all the time. This has had tens of thousands of workers at a shoe manufacturer, UUN Industry. Now, I never heard of these folks before I read this article, but evidently they're making shoes for Adidas, Nike, Converse, New Balance, $7.5 billion a year, 400,000 workers, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, etc. The global assembly line, right? And China has become the central global assembly line in the world today. So it's not a one-way street. This is a two-way street. World capital depends on China. China depends on world capital. It's an integrated, codependent relationship. It's not U.S. is dependent on them, China is dependent on the U.S. or Europe. It's codependency and integrated finance. So of the world's 500 largest transnational corporations, 483 operate in China. And there's over 286,000 foreign affiliates operating in China. Other foreign affiliates are affiliates of major transnational corporations, right? So GE, for example, has, I think, 120 foreign affiliates. Siemens has something like 320 foreign affiliates around the world. Now, just to give you an idea of how big that is, when we talk about China having 286,000 foreign affiliates and another 10,000 in Hong Kong, the next biggest country, and this will probably surprise you, is Romania with close to 90,000. The next biggest is the Czech Republic with 71,000. That's Western Europe, right? Coming into Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall. But then, we talk about the BRICS, India, right? South Africa, Brazil. Brazil has just a little over 4,000 foreign affiliates. India has just a little over 2,000 foreign affiliates. Again, China has 286,000 foreign affiliates operating there. It's just mind-blowing in terms of the numbers and the importance and the centralization of production there. In terms of foreign direct investment, right, which is a key economic figure when you think about globalization and you think about particular manufacturing. So inward FDI in 2008 was about 108 billion. Only the United States and France had more incoming foreign direct investment than China. outgoing. So what about China investing outward? Because what you hear is all this money coming into China, all this manufacturing coming into China. Well, it's flowing the other way too, and more. So again in 2008, China's plus Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is part of China, had outward flows of 112 billion, which puts them in the same league as Japan and the UK, a little behind, about 10, 15 billion behind the UK and Japan. So China is also becoming a major exporter of capital, as well as a major importer of capital. So let's look a bit at, therefore, some finance, aspects of finance and co-investment. So the largest, the private industry in China is very important, both from foreign investments and also indigenous Chinese corporations, particularly IT, like Tencent and Alibaba and Weibo, huge. Bigger than Facebook, bigger than eBay now. But when you look at the largest, most important state-owned enterprises, and here I'm talking about Bank of China, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, China Construction Bank, Sinopec, PetroChina, railroad construction, telecommunications, we find that all the major financial institutions in the West have investments in all these state-owned enterprises. China is careful to keep more than 51%, often up to 80%. But we find BlackRock, Fidelity, JP Morgan, Invesco, Vanguard, UBS, Franklin Street, all the majors are in there. And you don't have to have the majority of stock to, this idea of control and power, that, as long as China has 51% or more, it's Chinese control. I don't really see it as that. How I see it is that this is transnational capital, and capital in the West trusts and has confidence in finance in China to act as typical capitalist, financial, and manufacturing organizations that are going to maximize efficiency and maximize profits, and they're going to make money along with the Chinese, right? So it's not about control, it's about cross and mutual investments and best practices. And Western capitalists trust Chinese state capitalists and private capitalists to do best practice, transnational capital, neoliberal best practice. That's what dominates throughout. Now, BlackRock is interesting, and I just want to talk just a little bit about BlackRock, even though it's Western, just to give you an idea of the role of finance in transnational capitalist class theory. BlackRock, how many of you have heard of BlackRock, by the way, just out of interest? BlackRock is the largest financial institution in the world. It has $4.4 trillion under, it's an investment corporation. I just was reading an article just the other day. It's hard to find out how much is foreign, but in the last quarter, another $15 billion was invested in BlackRock. Another $15 billion added to that $4.4 trillion. $10 billion of that were foreign investors. BlackRock is a U.S. financial corporation. So the last quarter, 75% of the money coming into BlackRock is from outside the United States. Now, I think this is key in understanding transnational capitalism, because the way the transnational capitalist class exploits labor and extracts surplus value is through financial institutions. That's how it happens these days. So when you look at JP Morgan, when you look at Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, Barclays, Chinese Construction Bank, BlackRock, I don't care who you're looking at or what country, that will give you the wrong impression. What you have to try to understand is who in the hell is putting their money into these financial organizations, and when you look at that, you start to understand that money is coming from every country in the world. capitalists in Nigeria, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Russia, in China, US, in Germany, in the UK. They're all pouring money into these financial institutions, which organize it centrally. Financial institutions have become the organizing centers for transnational capitalism, and it goes out into investments all over the world, across borders, and therefore they're extracting the surplus value from country after country, from the working class in countries all over the world, centralizing the surplus value back into their investors who come from all over the world. So if you just think JP Morgan is US, BlackRock is US, Deutsche Bank is Germany, you're off on the wrong path here. You know, it's global. So I was just looking at one BlackRock fund. You know, I mean, hundreds of funds. This just gives you a little idea. This is a $6.3 billion fund out of $4.4 trillion. They have 475 common stocks in 34 countries, 729 million in 95 corporate bonds from 24 countries, investments in 16 different currencies. So altogether, that's 570 companies from all over the world. This is just one little fund, right? And that's how you have to understand finance today. You know, when you look at these guys, no, you look J.P. Morgan just holding American stock. Come on, that's. I don't know when that stopped. It was a long time ago, though, believe me. Now, is that just the way Western finance operates? No, this is the way Chinese finance operates too. So let's look at CIC, which is China's sovereign wealth fund. And every time you look at their sovereign wealth fund, it goes up another couple billion. I mean, it's incredible. But it's one of the largest. Sovereign wealth funds are state-held funds that are invested. Norway has one of the biggest ones because of their oil. Doha, UAE have big sovereign wealth funds. China's sovereign wealth fund is, let me see if I have the overall figure here. I think it was close to 900 billion or 500 billion. Anyways, here's a list of what the state sovereign wealth fund is investing in. Besides Blackstone and BlackRock and Morgan Stanley, they have shares in AIG, Apple, Bank of America, Citicorp, Citigroup, Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, Motorola, News Corp, and Visa. Morgan Stanley's CEO is on their advisory group. They own invested Research in Motion, which produces BlackBerry in Canada. Another $1 billion in Oak Tree Capital Management, another $1 billion in Kazakhstan, and also a lot of money invested in government bonds in Europe. So they bought bonds in Greece and Portugal, $8 billion in bonds and Spanish debt. When all those countries went into debt, they were out there buying bonds. And they own another, 10% of Heathrow Airport, 9% of Thames Water, which is the major water utility in the UK, et cetera, et cetera. So Chinese state transnational capital, the outflow is also going out to corporations all over the world, just like the inflow is coming in, right? It's cross-border, $1 trillion in economy. Here's a Fortune quote. The U.S. ought to set aside its current economic insecurity and answer a simple question correctly. If the Chinese want to park more of their money in American assets, why wouldn't we open up our pocket and take it? So this is an old, what Fortune is saying is this old paranoia about, sovereign wealth, this is government money, they got a hidden agenda, they're going to take over our corporations. What Fortune is saying is money is money. Capital is capital. It's flowing over borders everywhere. If the Chinese want to give us more capital, more power to us, more power to them. Let's take it. Let's open up our pockets, right? This is the attitude of transnational capital. Here's another quote from David Rubenstein, the CEO of Carlyle, one of the giant hedge funds. He says China is going to set the tone for private equity because a large number of their sovereign wealth funds are going to be investing large amounts of money outside of China, and they're going to be setting the rules and the patterns for what some of those investments are going to be. The United States has been the dominant player in private equity for the last 30 or 40 years. China will soon be almost as important as the United States and may replace the United States at some point because of the enormous amount of money that's being invested through CIC and other organizations. And it's estimated that maybe by 2020, China will have something like $1 to $2 trillion invested abroad. So the last little part of this talk, I just want to, about the individual wealth of some of the Chinese capitalists and the Chinese wealthy folks. So many of you are probably following some of the news about tax havens and the trillions of dollars that are out in tax havens, and how, you know, all these corporations are keeping billions and billions of dollars overseas so they won't be taxed, or putting them in the Cayman Islands, or putting them in Luxembourg, or wherever. So what are the Chinese doing in terms of shoving their money out of the country like the Russians and like the Americans do? Well, here, China has become a leading market for offshore havens that peddle secrecy, tax shelters, and international deal making. Western banks are the middlemen in helping Chinese clients to set up trust companies in the British Virgin Islands and Samoa and other offshore centers associated with hidden wealth. By some estimates, between 1 to 4 trillion in untraced assets have left China since 2000. So now that's not unusual for any country. If you look at the Germans, if you look at the Americans, if you look at the British, the Russians, they're all doing the same thing in terms of tax havens. The thing here, the point that I'm making, is that the Chinese capitalists are no different in terms of these tax havens. And it's interesting, President Xi's older sister is evidently a multi-millionaire real estate property corporation. Last comments, you know, Xi, current president, has gone on a pretty serious anti-corruption, and more than just window dressing. I mean, it looks like they're going after a couple ex-Politburo members. It's the first time that's ever happened. So serious stuff. But I think the thing is that, and I think this is one of the strong arguments for constitutionality and the rule of law, is that no one in China is safe. It depends who's in power. I mean, if everybody's family is involved, which is pretty much true, and everybody can be tainted with a level of corruption, then unless you have some type of institutionalized democratic court system, that it becomes arbitrary. It becomes who's up and who's down politically. So when you look at the Bo Xilai trial, and he was taken down for corruption, actually, you know, him and his wife had a couple million. Some of these other families, like Wen, Prime Minister Wen, a couple billion. I mean, Bo Xilai was small time compared to some of these other guys. So for a lot of Chinese, like the people I met who said, we love Bo Xilai, it was a political purge. It didn't have to do with corruption. And that's the interesting thing about the Cultural Revolution, just to bring it back to the beginning, because the Chinese leadership is sort of in a catch-22 with the Cultural Revolution. All these guys were sent down to farms in the 1960s, but none of them can say it was a bad experience. In fact, all of them say it was a good experience. They said, yeah, we lived with the peasants for 2 or 3 years and got to understand their problems. That's why we want to modernize China today. To improve conditions. I understand what poverty and grinding poverty is in the countryside. So on one side, you want to attack that aspect of the Maoists and Bo Xilai left, Cultural Revolution, these mass movements get out of control, people's lives are destroyed. But on the other hand, all the leadership has to say, well, personally, it was a good experience. Sort of a catch-22 for them, you know. And so, anyways, I want to draw it to a close because I know we have a lot of experience, a lot of people have a lot to say out here in the audience. But that's what I've been looking at for the last couple of years, and I hope it helps us to provide some interesting information. Thanks.
Do we need to move that mic over?
Move the microphone forward,
Yeah.
more into the light.
Into the light, yeah.
More? That's pretty good.
Okay. I switched that.
Hi, thank you for your talk. That was quite erudite and enlightening. Living up to my reputation as a time hog, I'm going to have to keep it short anyway. I had a friend who was a Sinophile, and he went to China and got himself a Chinese wife. She was from her family from Inner Mongolia. And I was informed that just like in the South and Appalachian United States, the Chinese army Mongolians are overrepresented in the Chinese army. Excuse me, sorry. And he fought as a young man in the Great Revolution, and he was a commander of a local commander of a garrison force at the time at Tiananmen Square. And when the government decided to eliminate the protesters in Tiananmen Square, he was given the order to eliminate them. And his response was, I won't move on or order my men to shoot on my countrymen unless I get that order in writing. And he didn't last more than a couple days, which is one of the reasons they had to bring in garrisons from outside of Beijing to do the deed. But my question is, how is Tiananmen Square and the protest movement and its crackdown looked on by this group? Was it looked at as an overabundance of democracy? Was it looked at as the crackdown being an overreaction? That's my question. Thanks.
Nobody talked about Tiananmen Square, and I think that's one of the taboo topics, from what I understand. Yeah.
Well, my friend, when he started talking to Chinese people who were sent here, mostly to study nuclear engineering, the Cultural Revolution was a taboo topic, and he had a hard time getting them to talk about it. So, I guess it comes in whatever, in 30-year spurts.
Yeah, well, like I said, the Cultural Revolution is starting to be talked about. And in fact, some people, I mean, there's been some interesting articles about students who abuse their teachers and principals now sort of recanting and sort of the public reaction to them. But Tiananmen Square, that I think, I think it's, even to type it in on the internet, it brings it up immediately and it gets censored. So people really don't talk about that.
They're still digesting it.
Or trying to eliminate it from memory. I mean, one just interesting thing is when I was there just about 5 days after there was this terrorist attack in front of the Forbidden City where a car drove in to a crowd and killed about 5 people from, the Uyghurs, sorry, thank you. And when I was in China, there was another Uyghur, this very serious incident, but in their national area. And I had no idea it happened. I mean, you talk about when it's not in the press, it doesn't become reality. But my wife had read about it, and she was worried about where I was in China, if I was anywhere near it. We had no damn idea that it was even going on, because it wasn't on TV, it wasn't in the paper, it didn't exist in Beijing. So that's sort of like what they're doing with Tiananmen Square.
So all I take from your exposition is that there's little hope of ending a broader austerity and having a greater concentration of capital. When I see the transnationals coming into various companies, not really being regulated by any of the nations any longer, that they come in under the expectation that taxes will be reduced and wages will be reduced, and if you don't like it, we're leaving. So it looks like what U.S. has been doing is being played on by other so-called communist parties that are trying to expand and capitalize in the same way that the U.S. has been capitalizing, basically keeping these private corporations, global wanderers who have no ties to any nation and will not be regulated because there's no ability to negotiate with them because they just say, if you don't like it, we'll just go elsewhere.
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's actually complex because the labor movement is getting more and more active in China. There's a lot of pressure on the official trade union to start to act like an actual real trade union, but there's lots of independent strikes going on all the time. So a lot of the transnational corporations actually pay better than local Chinese capitalists. Some are horrible sweatshops, but others actually have better labor standards. There's that complexity. And at the last, not the recent National Congress, but the one before this last one, there was a whole debate over new labor legislation. So labor rights were actually extended about 4 years ago, and that has led to actually more strikes and more protests, particularly from the new generation of workers that I talked about coming into China. The first wave of worker protests were from the old state-owned enterprises that were shutting down back in the late 90s, early 2001. The last 5 years or so has really been the new generation of workers who have come in and who will leave their jobs. I mean, because there's jobs and so much manufacturing, you could walk out and go somewhere else, and that's pretty common. So the labor situation is quite interesting, there's, for example, some protests going on at Walmart right now that's attracted some international attention, where actually the official trade union has taken a stand for the workers, one of the first times. So it's, again, it's complex with a lot of different levels there.
Yeah, I just want to mention the union that you mentioned, the manufacturer of I just
shoes?
read the shoes.
Yeah.
I just read that there's a strike of 40,000 workers. I just read the news before I left the house today.
Right.
That's going on. That strike helps if it's broad enough where people can't just continually flee the way U.S. did. They fled to Mexico, then to China, then to Taiwan, and keep on moving over to where they can find a more vulnerable population who can be forced into the factory. But you also have the problem of the corporations like General Electric paying zero income taxes to the United States, that they really don't owe anything. And so they operate really above the law. They become too big to fail or too independent to actually regulate. And that's what we seem to be having. We're getting a greater concentration of capital into few. And I would admit that there are some people that are coming up. You mentioned some people that are middle class that are gaining higher incomes, but I see that more as a buffer between the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor.
Yeah. Well, again, I think there's more complexity there. One is that there has been a lot of talk about corporations fleeing to like Vietnam and other lower wage, because wages are coming up in China, actually. But it's not so easy because China has an excellent infrastructure, has hundreds of thousands of suppliers and networks. It's very developed, and you just can't walk away from that easily. So while a lot of these transnationals want to flee China, it's not quite so easy. Plus, they're all looking at the market in China, particularly if you're producing consumer goods. So one of the debates in China, and it's been going on for a while, is that they have to get away from the export market and develop the internal market more to have a stable, stronger economy. That means higher wages for the workers. That means workers are going to buy more stuff. That means So that
But
is
that
also,
means more national regulation. It means that
national more
that they're
regulation.
rooted into a nation and they're subject to national control, and there's going to be limits on the amount of profits a corporation have, and limits on how low wages can be dropped. And
Well,
that's what I don't see with the
yeah.
transnationals.
it may not limit, it may increase profits, it may raise wages, but sometimes more wages means a larger market, which means greater profits if you're in the right area. That's one of the things we're arguing here in the United States for a stimulus, right? Want to raise minimum wage, and they're saying, oh, that's good for companies too, because we'll go out and buy stuff. So again, there's all sorts of levels of complexity here. What you're saying is true, but there's other aspects that are true, and I think all those things are in conflict and being debated out.
Yeah, right, I'll let you go.
Okay.
Okay, I wish you would have given some percentages. You talk about a middle-class couple that in their 30s saving 200K. I don't know many American middle-class kids that have that. But what is the percentage compared those who make $1 a day in the sweatshops, or maybe less? That's a big question. But I'm wondering also about the same issue that you brought, and that is, looks like it's going to be the hegemony, not of nations, but the hegemony of the corporations in the world. And all the implications on two factors, and I don't know if you I wonder if you discussed it in your conference. One is obviously the distribution of resources and income, social justice. The other is on planet issues, which are really, really burning. And that corporations so far were trying to sweep them under the carpet. Climate issues that we have to approach.
Mm-hmm. On the size of the middle class, definition is a little hard. I mean, 200,000, that sounds pretty upper middle class. I mean, that's pretty significant savings for this couple. Some studies just came out this week on middle class. Have been running in the Sun Times, the World Middle Class, Financial Times, and it's described as anybody between $2 and $20 a day, which is quite different than our estimate. But I think some people talk about the middle class in China about 220 million, or 250 million. Is that what you guys heard? So that's almost the size of the American population. But again, it's 20% of the Chinese population. So there's still a lot of poor people. In terms of the environment, obviously China is facing huge problems. But it's interesting that China's moving on those problems too. Again, it's the complexity. Some of the worst air, urban air in the world is in Chinese cities. But yet they went from almost no production of solar power and no production of wind power to the #1 producer in both areas within 5 years because of state planning. It just went bam. Because of their production in particularly solar panels, that the price just plummeted, where it's now competitive in many areas with fossil fuels. Of course, that set off protectionist cries in Europe and the United States. As people started to import Chinese solar panels, although American production of solar panels is transnational. It goes on in Malaysia and Philippines, and they bring it back here too. So anyways, the Chinese are, I think, the leadership is very aware of the environmental problems. It's one of the top issues on their agenda. And I think they, understand they don't want it to be, I think from their point of view, trapped in international treaties. I think they're dragging their feet on that. They don't want to be held accountable by Western countries, Western imperialist countries, and the history is there. So they don't want to sign up to these targets, for 2020, 2050. But if you look at their actual policies of what's happening inside China, there's some good things. And Greenpeace just came out with this last week a very good report on China moving away from coal. That you could just go to Greenpeace and download a little about 10-page report on the environment in China.
My question was about the effect of the hegemony of the corporations on planet issues, all of them.
On planetary issues all over the world? Yeah, well, capitalism is an expansive, aggressive system that eats up resources. So, I mean, it's the labor question, the question of the exploitation of people and the exploitation of nature are totally interbound, and they're the two contradictions that are confronting capitalism like a speeding car going up against a wall. I mean, and I don't know, and I don't think they're going to be able to really solve it within the next 100 years. I think they'll make some progress on it, but I think millions of people worldwide will suffer because they won't be able to deal with it in a really deep-going, significant manner, or at least within the capitalist logic, rationality.
Thank you. Great talk. I'd like to ask though, in terms of becoming an emerging superpower, I'm focusing on the manufacturing aspect of things, moving forward with technology. One of the big issues the last 3 to 5 years is innovation in China. Can they catch up to the Western innovation? Okay, what do you see in that aspect? Because they've caught up, but in order to keep pace and then maybe surge ahead, they have to become innovative in their own right. I've heard the Chinese government is very concerned about this, and how does this impact their educational system for teaching the STEM subjects? Mm-hmm. And related to that, are these STEM subjects being taught in English in the universities?
Yeah, that's another issue that I think the leadership is very aware and concerned with, innovation, and as you pointed out, they are catching up. Intel, Microsoft, Siemens, they all have research and development institutions in China. China's been attracting a lot of academic science back home. But the West still has sort of a monopoly on a lot of technology. I don't think that's going to last, because I think once the knowledge is out there, knowledge, particularly in the type of information economy we have today, tends to be dispersed and people catch up, both in military technology as well as manufacturing technologies. But I do think they got to struggle with the education system and figure out how to make more innovative rather than rote learning. This has been one of the. Of course, rote learning is now becoming more popular in America with all these test taking, right? I mean, America's been. But with the university that I visited in Shantou, in the south, north of Guangdong, had about 8,000 students. They all spoke English. And one of the big benefactors is Lee from Hong Kong, the billionaire from Hong Kong. And they had a lot of sort of a much more open curriculum there. Not so much open politically, but open in terms of looking at the world and what's going on around the world more, and looking at the technology around the world and media around the world and all that type of stuff. So I think that you'll probably, and of course Shanghai students are scoring #1 on a lot of testing, global testing. So I think I think it will just get stronger as time goes on, but I think it's a 20, 30-year process.
But do you see English as really kind of a powerful force in the teaching of technical subjects? Because I have a hard time following technical subjects in Chinese.
I'm not that learned on language, although learning 2,200 characters, that's a rough road.
I know, I went to Chinese school as a kid for 6 years.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about rote learning. I was just thinking about this yesterday. I mean, you sort of have to initiate children into rote learning to learn the alphabet itself, what we learned, 24, 26 letters. So that sort of sets the stage when you're very young. So English may be a key to, sort of becoming that technically breakthroughs. I don't know. I wonder, do you know what all the R&D centers at Microsoft and Intel and Google have established? Do you know if they operate in English or in Mandarin?
I don't know that for a fact.
Yeah,
I know a little bit, I'll make it very short. Almost, for a long time, all science and technical subjects were taught in English. And without getting into the nitty-gritty of it, Chinese is notoriously imprecise because of the nature of Chinese writing. There have been more attempts to be able to teach technical subjects in science in Chinese, but still English has a tremendous amount of weight. And so I think in these centers, as an expedient, they're still going to English.
Yeah, that's what I would think too.
There may, who knows, again, who knows, it would require actually development of a new form of teaching of these subjects, teach it only in Mandarin. There may be an attempt at that, there may be a plan for that. I don't know, but that's...
What happened in the Soviet Union?
It's in the future.
Did they teach in English?
But the language wasn't, there wasn't the same language problem.
Right.
Because of the nature of the Chinese.
Right, Russian is alphabetic,
written
not
language.
character-based
Right.
like Chinese.
Alphabetically, alphabetically, you can phonetically represent all the English concepts.
So you'd have to develop new characters for new concepts.
Which is
in
unworkable.
Mandarin.
Which is not workable.
Right. So how do you say internet in
You
Chinese?
have to rephoneticize it, is what you do.
Yeah, rephoneticize it into...
So it's a big project. It's not impossible, it's a big project.
Pinyin is the start.
Japanese too.
Excellent talk, Jerry. I want to get a little more specificity here if we can. We were talking a lot about data, and I fully appreciate that. I was over there like in 2009, and like I got the factory tour, and I got the collective farm, the whole 9 yards. And one of the things that I heard over there, and I'm referencing, these were always obviously party people, with regards to like the urban working class in China. Even though these individuals were paid sometimes 4 and 5 times what they young male adults coming from rural areas into the urban centers and getting these jobs, they were still having a problem keeping these workers. And I mean, we've got this reserve army that, of course, is huge, but nonetheless, this was a concern that I heard over there, that even though they were better paid, for various and sundry reasons, they would stay on average maybe up to a maximum of like 3 years and then go home. Just could not. And if you saw, which I got the opportunity to really, up close, look at, they were living like in dormitories, and they had really, talk about an alienation situation. I was struck by the fact, and again, I wasn't really talking directly to any workers. I'm like being kind of like, given a show tour or something there. But my impression was that the average worker over there just, when they had free time and they were working a lot of hours on top of this all, they had nothing to do, was kind of this boredom. There were very real problems over there, which gets me to the heart of where I want to go with all this. And because you had touched upon this early on in your presentation about this concern about potential unrest. Can you maybe expand on it a little bit? Because I'm curious about the position, and I'm going again a different direction here too, but with regards, because you said at one point you had talked to somebody in the military, where's the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army? They're like a venerated institution in some regards there, and I think that their relationship to the Communist Party is rather unique insofar as when we think of political parties in the West, because obviously this is an element in their history that is of paramount importance, and maybe you can talk something along those lines. Pulling all this together, throw a lot out there. Sit down.
I really can't speak to the Chinese military attitude towards unrest, because they mainly use the police forces to crack down on demonstrators, which they do regularly, pretty successfully, and the court system is pretty prejudicial against anyone who's brought in, in front of the court. I think an interesting book in terms of thinking about that working class youth culture is this, I think it's called Factory Girls. It was written by a Chinese American woman who went back to China to go to her parents' village and then ended up staying for a couple of years. And she follows the story of about 4 or 5 young women workers who come into the city, first generation workers. It really gives you, I think, a really good sense of what life is like. I mean, when I talked about the youth culture, when I was out at night, man, in the malls, it was just all these young people hanging out, and all factory workers, and just, the little shops and buying dinner, checking each other out and looking at the clothes, and, it was just, well, we talked before about the urban centers are just growing so amazingly. So I think there's something like 300,000 to 400,000 officially recognized social protests every year in China. But what the Chinese Communist Party is doing is actually they go in and sort of mediate often between the factory and the workers, and they just try to stabilize it and cool it out and get a few concessions. What they've been most, I think, concerned about is regional and national movements emerging. So they want to keep these protests localized and controllable in that sense. And so I think one of the big debates is around what is the Chinese National Trade Union Federation, what's their role in the future? Are they going to be like our AFL-CIO, holding people back, or are they going to, maybe it will split. Maybe it'll be like the 1930s here with the CIO split of some kind, with, some people within the trade union, official trade movement uniting with the new activists and going out and struggling. It's hard to predict. All I can say is that those contradictions are there, and they gotta be resolved in some way. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot more social movements and social explosions.
What is the party representation in those formations that exist there? I mean, I know they're all over the block.
Well, there's almost no elections. That's one of the big demands, is to elect your own leadership. That has happened in a few places. So they're mostly appointed. I think the trade union has something like 900,000 officials, and so it's a huge bureaucracy. And the way the workers view them is they often represent management rather than.
And they're virtually all party members, aren't they?
Yeah.
The vast majority.
Yeah. A good source there is the Chinese Labor Bulletin. They're over in Hong Kong. And they come out with a lot of really good studies. They do a lot of labor support work on the mainland. Since those laws were passed that I mentioned about 4 years ago, there's like a set of like labor lawyers that have emerged as working with the labor protesters and the labor movements and stuff. On the other hand, if there's a march and they get into the streets, they disrupt traffic. The police come, they bust them up, and they arrest the leaders and send them off for 3 or 4 years. They're a little more lenient if you're going to protest and strike against a Japanese company, or a Taiwanese company rather than somebody else. Those national kind of, so like the big strikes that happened at Honda 2 years ago, and that did end up as a national movement. That they gave that a lot of room. But I think they gave that a lot of room because it was a Japanese. When the Japanese, Taiwanese, and Hong Kong are the 3 biggest investors in China. Taiwan has like 14 or 15 million employees in China. That's like 60% of the population of Taiwan itself. Yeah, it's huge.
I was in a factory there that was Taiwanese owned. It was the most regimented thing I've ever seen in my
Yeah, the
life.
Chinese, you don't want to work for the Taiwanese, man.
It's just unreal.
Yeah, yeah.
One last question from me. I ran into a guy who spent 2 tours of duty teaching English in China. Okay, and he and I got into a screaming match, really, about the nature of Confucianism in China, Confucian values. And I'm a baby boomer, but I grew up first generation American. Okay, and I saw Confucian values. They were never directly addressed, but they were there. We were brought up with this family hierarchy thing. And he's saying that Confucianism is dead in China. I was there. I'm telling you, it's dead in China. It's buried. Okay, it's gone. I say, well, really? In the new waves of immigration I see Confucian values alive and well, as intense as in my childhood when I was being brought up. And he's still screaming at me, it's dead, it's dead. Is it dead?
No, in fact, there's a Confucian trend within the Communist Party itself. Back in the day, I read this pamphlet, How to Be a Good Communist by Liu Shaoqi. And Liu Shaoqi, of course, was the president, was one of the main targets of the Cultural Revolution. My impression of that pamphlet was very Confucian. How to be a good communist was to be a good Confucian official of the state. And so I think that has very deep roots. I think it parallels the anti-corruption campaign in part. I mean, I think that's why it has some grip within the Communist Party, because people say, well, we need a strong central government. That's the party. But you got to be honest. You got, so
Right.
it plays into
At
it.
the core of Confucianism is ethics.
Yeah. So I think it's alive and well. But again, it's one of a large puzzle, right? Yeah. It can't be dead. It's part of history. Nothing part of history is dead. It's
And there's a big Confucian revival by the Communist Party, like you said. It's being revived for reasons I don't know.
anti-corruption and loyalty.
I guess that wraps it then, huh?
Cool.
You done? All right, thanks, Jerry.